The barracks smelled of oil and pine when the new recruits first arrived. Floors were scrubbed until they shone dull and pale, boots lined in perfect ranks at the edge of each sleeping platform. They were boys more than men, but the gate swallowed their hesitation quickly. The first sound that claimed them was the bark of an instructor's voice, sharp and absolute, cutting through the cool morning. "Here." Questions died at birth. Obedience began before thought. Days opened before dawn. In the blue-gray light, bodies sprang from straw mats, hands moving with practiced economy to fold bedding and polish buckles. Bare feet slapped until boots could be laced, and rifles, older Arisakas, heavy and long, were lifted from racks with reverence that bordered on worship. Training was not presented as a series of techniques, but as the shaping of spirit. The instructor spoke often of Bushido, the code that tied each man's breath to loyalty and death. Words like duty and honor flowed on the cold air, while muscles trembled under the weight of endless drill. Marching was an art here. Columns moved like brushstrokes across the parade ground, heels striking gravel in unison. The sergeants prowled with bamboo canes, their faces unreadable but their ears keen. A turned head, a slack shoulder, even a flicker of fatigue could summon a sting across the back. It was not cruelty for its own sake, the older men said, but the trimming away of weakness. War, they promised, would demand more than skill. It would demand silence when afraid, stillness when dying, and the courage to hold a bayonet until the last drop of blood. These early lessons felt like iron poured into young veins. Meals were plain and small. Rice stretched with barley, pickled vegetables, a thin broth when available. At first, the hunger felt like punishment, but soon it was explained as sharpening, proof that a soldier could move and fight without abundance. They learned to pack rations so light and spare that a week's worth could fit into a single pouch. They were told stories of samurai enduring starvation on campaign, and of fathers who gave up their portion to sons going to war. Full stomachs, the instructors warned, made men slow. Lean ones endured. Weapons training carried its own rhythm. Rifle drill became a ritual. Clean, aim, fire, repeat until muscle and trigger were one. Bayonet practice, though, left the deepest mark. Dummies filled with straw stood waiting under the morning sun, and the recruits were driven forward with shouts, stabbing and slashing until their arms burned. Each thrust was accompanied by guttural cries meant to drown out fear. They were taught where to strike for certainty, how to finish an opponent quickly. The killing, though never named as such, was woven into the notion of duty. To hesitate was to invite shame. To falter was to betray emperor and family alike. Spiritual conditioning was constant. Shrine visits before training. Prayers offered to banners stiff with the weight of history. Lectures spoke of Yamato's spirit, a force older and stronger than any machine. Death, the teachers insisted, was not defeat if met with resolve. Better to die standing than to live in surrender. Captivity was not an option. It would stain one's ancestors. In evenings, after the last inspection and silent bow before lights out, the barracks murmured with talk of sacrifice. Boys traced characters of courage in their notebooks and whispered promises to bring honor home. Small comforts disappeared over time. Letters were censored, books rationed. Individuality dissolved into formation. They learned to move as one, to think as one, to accept that their lives belonged to something larger. The world outside the gates began to feel distant, almost trivial compared to the weight of this calling. Some wept quietly into sleeves, but tears dried fast. Others found strength in comradeship. The arm of a bunkmate during punishing night marches, the shared secret of exhaustion after yet another round of push-ups in cold rain. Instructors reminded them often of the enemy. Materialistic, soft, unwilling to bleed. America was described as a land of weak men who could not bear deprivation. The recruits believed it because believing gave shape to their suffering. Each blister, each bruise became proof they were harder, sharper, destined to overcome an opponent untested by real pain. If their rifles were older, their rations thinner, their gear patched and worn, it did not matter. Spirit, they were told, would close the gap. By the time the gates opened again and order sent them outward, the transformation was nearly complete. The boys who had stepped onto the parade ground months before had been replaced by soldiers with hollowed cheeks and steady eyes. They could march until their feet bled, sleep in mud, strike without hesitation. Pride hummed inside them, quiet, dense, unyielding. They believed themselves forged, stronger than steel, part of an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries of warriors. Whatever waited across the sea, they told themselves, could not withstand men so thoroughly trained to endure and to die. They were ready, or so it seemed. Cold mornings taught economy before any manual did. Steam curled faintly from metal bowls of rice stretched with barley, portions small enough that the first swallow was more air than food. The recruits sat cross-legged in silence, chopsticks working slowly, mindful not to finish too soon. Hunger was no accident here. It was lesson and test. To fight lean meant to be lean, to know the edge between sufficiency and waste, and to accept it as strength. Officers walked the aisles with measured steps, eyes sweeping bowls for grains left uneaten. Waste brought punishment, not only because food was scarce, but because each grain had weight. Farmers, supply ships, and mothers' hand behind it. Marches began before the body could recover from breakfast. Packs were adjusted until straps bit into shoulders, rifles balanced across spines already rubbed raw. The road unrolled without mercy. Stone, dust, mud, sometimes all in a single day. A day's water was rationed carefully, sipped more than swallowed, because the next well might be dry or far beyond reach. On these marches, the cadets learned to measure themselves against distance and deprivation. There was no praise for endurance. Survival was assumed. At rest stops, men knelt in the dirt, loosening boots only enough to let swollen feet breathe before the whistle sent them up again. Ammunition was treated with a reverence usually reserved for relics. Drill masters issued cartridges by the handful, never more, and demanded each brass case be returned after practice. Targets were reused until the paper shredded, and even then the wooden frames were patched and saved. Live-fire exercises were brief, controlled, deliberate. Marksmanship was built on patience. Make the shot count, there will not be another. Some cadets joked that the rifles weighed more than the bullets allotted for them. The joke died quickly when the next inspection came, and an instructor's hand found a missing round. Equipment told the same story. Boots might be resoled 3 times. Jackets patched until the original fabric disappeared beneath repairs. Helmets dented from training blows were hammered flat and issued again. There was pride in making do, in learning to strip and rebuild a rifle what little oil and rag one had, in finding ways to carry everything without complaint. When something failed, ingenuity was expected. Leather cut from an old strap could mend a sling. A length of rope could replace a broken pack buckle. Scarcity became its own sort of training, a daily rehearsal for battle conditions where supply lines would falter. At night, when lanterns dimmed and the day's noise receded, quiet voices passed along stories meant a hardened resolve. Veterans of earlier campaigns described long stretches without rations, men surviving on grass or roots, patrols lost and still fighting. These tales were not warnings but promises. You will endure worse, and you will stand. The idea seeped in until one itself felt honorable. To be hungry and still move forward was proof of worth. To go without and yet remain disciplined was victory already won. Religion and ritual wove through this austerity. Before meals, heads bowed, not only in gratitude but in quiet recognition of cost. Each drop of water, each grain of rice tied back to the nation's struggle. This awareness, instructor said, would make waste impossible and obedience natural. Pain was a gift, a forging fire. Supplies were thin because the empire needed every ship, every sack of rice at the front. Soldiers who learned to need little were soldiers who could be sent anywhere. Letters home rarely spoke of lack. Pride forbade complaint. Instead, recruits wrote of toughness, of becoming men, of training that stripped away softness. But in the spaces between lines, hunger and thrift shaped them more than rifle drill. Their bodies adapted. Stomachs shrank, strides lengthened, hands calloused. Their minds followed, accepting a world where nothing came easy and nothing could be counted on but one's own endurance. When shipments of American goods were mentioned in distant newspapers, crates of canned meat, endless convoys of trucks, the contrast felt remote, almost irrelevant. Those were tales from another planet. Here, the cadets believed, Strength grew in the absence of plenty. If the enemy was comfortable, it only proved his weakness. Scarcity was their crucible, and each empty belly, each bullet counted twice became a badge unseen, but fiercely carried. They would go to war with little, and in the believing, they felt ready. The first word of the enemy arrived not through official bulletins, but through whispers carried by men returning from the sea and the islands. They came back leaner than when they left, faces drawn by salt and distance, but their stories were strangely measured. In barracks and mess halls, recruits listened as veterans described brief, jagged encounters with Americans somewhere far across the Pacific. There were ambushes in jungle gullies, sudden gunfire from palm shadows, patrols that dissolved after a few shots. The details, though fractured, were repeated until they felt like knowledge. The Americans, it was said, were clumsy with their weapons, quick to panic, unable to match the calm precision taught here at home. The instructors leaned hard into these accounts. Before morning drills, an officer would pause and recite a victory won by stealth and courage, emphasizing how easily foreign soldiers broke once the first bayonet charge carried through. He spoke of disorganized lines, men shouting in confusion, officers scrambling to hold positions. Each tale grew a little sharper with retelling. American conscripts who fired wildly and missed, young men from cities and farms who lacked the discipline to stand against seasoned fighters. The message was clear and deliberate. Your training, your hunger, your marches have made you something they are not. Maps came out during evening lectures. Long poles tapped across blue oceans and dotted islands newly claimed. Arrows curved in smooth arcs, marking Japan's advance like brushstrokes on a scroll. In these rooms, the enemy was a shadow, a clumsy opponent who fell back before the Emperor's disciplined sons. There were jokes, quiet but proud, about Americans needing comfort in soft beds, about soldiers too used to plenty to endure mud and heat. Even reports of their weapons, new rifles, heavier artillery, were softened by promises that machines could not overcome spirit. Letters from the front, when they reached the training depots, were handled with ceremony. They often spoke of hardship, but wrapped it in pride. We struck fast, one would say, and they scattered. Another described a night raid where Americans fled and left their gear behind. These fragments were read aloud by candlelight, copied into notebooks, and passed around until edges frayed. They were a kind of nourishment, proof that the enemy bled and ran like anyone else, perhaps more quickly. On the rifle range, this image took physical form. Recruits were taught to picture their adversaries soft and hesitant. Instructors barked, "They fear you before you strike," as boys sighted along barrels at wooden silhouettes. During bayonet practice, the dummies were sometimes draped in scraps of khaki cloth to suggest American uniforms. Each thrust and shout landed not just on straw, but on the idea of an enemy too weak to close the distance. There were occasional cracks in the story. A senior sergeant, gray at the temples, once mentioned that Americans shot well from behind cover, that their machine guns were relentless. He was hushed quickly, a warning glance from another instructor silencing the moment. A recruit who asked about American planes and their reach was given a clipped reply. They can fly far, but spirit flies farther. Doubt was not forbidden, exactly, but it had no place to settle in a culture built on conviction. When cargo came in, crates of boots, bundles of cloth, the talk returned to contrast. They need excess, the trainer said. We need only will. They made abundance sound like weakness, proof that Americans could not fight without comfort. Hardship here was a weapon sharpened against that softness. Each blister, each hungry march became another imagined advantage. By the time the recruits packed their few belongings and boarded trains or trucks toward staging ports, the picture of the enemy was nearly complete. Across the ocean waited men who did not know true suffering, men who would falter when the jungle closed in, who would yield on the steel of a bayonet and the fire of unwavering eyes. The cadets believed it because they had to. It bound their sacrifices to purpose. They carried the stories like amulets against fear, convinced that training and hunger and centuries of warrior code would meet a soft modern world and cut through it cleanly. No one yet had seen what waited beyond those first skirmishes, the full weight of an industrial nation gathering itself for war. For now there was only confidence, and the distant sound of waves carrying rumors home. The first island smelled of salt and rot when the boat scraped against its black sand. Dawn hung heavy and wet, palms leaning under invisible weight. The sea behind them was already pulling back into mist, leaving only the muffled thrum of engines as landing craft withdrew. The young soldiers rose from crouch to crouch, rifles lifted, blades fixed, eyes hard the way instructors had taught. They moved inland with the predator's patience, feet quiet among tangled roots and vine. Contact came sooner than expected. An American patrol emerged on narrow track, boots too loud, shoulders loose under heavy packs. The Japanese soldiers held their breath, shadows pressed close to earth. At the whispered signal, the first volley cracked, sharp, disciplined shots that cut the quiet cleanly. Then came the charge. Bayonets flashed silver between leaves. Cries burst from throats trained to drown fear and sound. The patrol broke almost instantly, one man dropping his weapon as he fled, another stumbling backward before vanishing into green. Blood and silence followed, the kind of silence that feels like proof. The lessons had worked. Surprise, ferocity, the will to close distance, all of it lived and breathed here. The push inland continued for days. Units leapfrogged through gullies and creeks, using terrain like old friends. They ambushed columns on ridgelines, slipped around machine gun nests, turned supply trails into killing grounds. Each success hardened belief. Reports came back of Americans abandoning gear, leaving behind packs stuffed with tins of food and unfamiliar medicines. Some soldiers pocketed chocolate and marveled at its sweetness. Others mocked the softness that needed such luxuries. Nights filled with cautious celebration, whispered laughter, quiet boasting, the clink of canteens. Hunger and fatigue were sharp but dulled by triumph. Jungle tactics proved their worth again and again. Concealment was easy among ferns taller than men, and patience turned the forest itself into a weapon. Hours could pass motionless beneath the canopy, waiting for the sound of boots or voices. Then a sudden strike, bullets close, bayonets closer, before melting away unseen. The Americans seemed bewildered, firing wildly into green walls that swallowed their rounds. When planes roared overhead, their bombs fell wide or vanished into thickets, leaving nothing but churned mud. The soldiers whispered about soft pilots and used to such cover. Every successful clash fed an unspoken rhythm. Advance by night, dig in by dawn, strike when opportunity whispered. By the third week, men moved with easy familiarity, as though the island itself had become an ally. They navigated hidden paths, drank sparingly from muddy pools, scavenged fruit when rations ran thin. Hardship seemed confirmed strength. It did not feel like cost. Each empty belly was matched by another victory, each blister by another retreating enemy column. The war, at least here, seemed to be unfolding exactly as the teachers had promised. Messages home, when senses allowed them, carried quiet pride. "We have proven our training true," one wrote in neat brushstrokes. Another described capturing enemy rifles and ammunition with almost clinical detachment, yet tucked a small square of chocolate into his letter, as if to show how trivial comfort was to them. Officers praised endurance and resourcefulness, telling stories to keep morale high. Men fighting off ambushes with bayonets alone, squads melting back into jungle like smoke. Even those wounded and evacuated spoke of courage under fire, not of fear or doubt. But woven into the edges of victory were threads few recognized yet. The Americans who fled sometimes returned days later with heavier weapons, probing cautiously but learning. Wreck supply dumps were quickly replaced. Even on these first islands, strange metal shapes appeared offshore, ships larger than imagination, silhouettes bristling with guns. Their presence was easy to ignore while success filled the air, but some eyes lingered on the horizon longer than before. For now, though, the men believed what they had been taught. The jungle could swallow the enemy whole, and their spirit, honed by hunger and discipline, would always break softer foes. Nights passed under stars veiled by cloud and smoke, fires small and hidden, whispers of home traded for stories of triumph. They felt forged and unstoppable, living proof that sacrifice had meaning. The idea that war could shift beyond the reach of bayonet and ambush had not yet taken root. On these first islands, courage still felt enough, and the illusion of invincibility held fast. It began with a low hum that did not belong to the jungle. At first the men thought it distant thunder rolling off the sea, but the sound grew and deepened until it pressed against their chests. Eyes turned upward to a sky still pale with dawn. Out past the tree-line, a dull gray line of ships had appeared overnight. Too far to count clearly, yet massive enough to blot the horizon. Then the ocean seemed to shudder and flash. Shells screamed overhead, invisible at first, then tearing open the air at a howl that pulled men flat into mud and root. The first salvos shattered more than palm trunks. Foxholes dug by hand over long days disintegrated in seconds. Positions mapped and measured to the last sandbag vanished under fountains of earth and splintered wood. Bunkers cracked like pottery. Logs meant to stop bullets splintered under steel heavier than anything imagined. Men who had once felt safe behind camouflage and clever angles were suddenly exposed, choking on dust and smoke, deafened by the roar. Some shouted orders. Others simply pressed faces to the dirt and prayed that the next blast would fall wide. When the shelling paused, the sky changed. A new vibration, sharper and closer, came from beyond the clouds. Tiny silver shapes emerged, growing larger until wings cut the light. Carrier planes, scores of them, swept over in ordered waves. Engines shrieked as bombs dropped with mechanical precision. The jungle canopy that had been protective friend and secret ally now caught fire. Leaves turned to ash in seconds. Tree trunks snapped and burned. Camouflage nets dissolved like paper. Men ran, stumbled, crawled. Anywhere not yet burning, but nowhere stayed safe long. Every attempt to regroup was met with another dive, another concussion that turned dugouts to shrapnel. The careful rhythm of training unraveled under this new violence. Bayonet charges meant nothing against targets too high to reach. Marksmanship failed when there was no single enemy to aim for, only metal birds screaming and vanishing. Officers tried to rally with shouted commands, but their voices drowned in the endless blast and whine. Some fired rifles skyward out of reflex more than hope. Others clutched amulets and muttered the prayers of boys who had been taught courage was enough. By midday, the battlefield bore no shape the men recognized. Paths mapped and memorized disappeared under fallen timber and craters. Whole sections of defense were gone, simply gone, as though swallowed by some invisible sea. Communication lines snapped. Messengers sent running never returned. Survivors huddled in whatever cover remained, stunned less by wounds than by the scale of what they faced. The enemy had not shown his face, yet everything built to stop him lay in ruins. When night finally crawled back, it brought no comfort. Fires smoldered where forests had been, casting long, shifting shadows. Ammunition dumps were silent wrecks. Food stores scattered and burning. Men took count of rifles, bandaged one another with torn shirts, whispered names and prayers. The old belief that spirit and clever ground could withstand any assault trembled for the first time. Hunger and pain they understood. But this was different. Destruction arriving before a fight even began, from a distance unreachable, with a rhythm cold and impersonal. There was no duel of courage here, only math and machinery falling from the sky. Some tried to restore confidence with old phrases, promising that tomorrow they would regroup and strike back. Yet eyes betrayed unease. They had glimpsed something their teachers had not described. An enemy who could remake the very ground, who could erase safety before a single soldier landed. The sky itself seemed claimed. Even silence after the bombardment felt false, a pause in some endless mechanism rather than true peace. The jungle no longer promised protection. It felt thin now, as if one more wave of steel and fire could sweep it away completely. For the first time since leaving the barracks, doubt crept in, not spoken, not admitted, but present, a quiet weight in every chest. They had been taught to endure hunger, thirst, and the edge of a blade. No one had taught them how to fight a storm that never showed its face, a storm that began miles away and fell with unanswerable force. And so they lay awake in the dark, ears straining for the next hum beyond the trees, wondering if courage alone could survive a sky that had learned to kill. At first it seemed the night itself had broken apart. The darkness pulsed and thundered as if the island's spine were cracking. Sleepers jolted upright in their pits, confusion colliding with instinct. They had endured bombardment before, but this was different, a sustained, rolling violence that seemed to have no edge or center. The air shook. Dirt sifted down from overhead cover, blinding eyes and choking throats. Then came the second wave, deeper and closer, as though the enemy had drawn a careful map of every hiding place. American artillery had found its rhythm. Shells arced from somewhere unseen, offshore beyond hills, over jungle no scout had reached, and landed with a dreadful certainty. Each impact felt calculated, not random like earlier naval strikes. Ranges shortened with uncanny speed, creeping forward in measured steps that drove men deeper into their shallow dugouts. Mortars joined the symphony, whistling with shrill finality before snapping into bursts that flung splinters and hot earth in all directions. Whole sections of trench collapsed. Shelters once thought safe folded like paper under the weight of blast after blast. Men clung to rifles they could not use, reduced the passengers in a storm of iron. Training had promised cover. Dig deep, brace strong, hold fast. But the ground betrayed them. Foxholes shook, edges crumbling, roofs of palm and bamboo shredding under impact. The volume alone defied comprehension. For every round fired back, 10, 20, 50 answered from invisible batteries. Those who dared peek above ground caught glimpses of distant flashes along ridges and beaches. Disciplined gunners adjusting with cold patience, correcting angle and wind with instruments and experience far beyond what the young soldiers had imagined. Attempts to move between positions turned desperate. Runners bent double, darting through smoke only to vanish in eruptions of dirt and light. Messages rarely arrived intact. One squad tried to relocate a machine gun to a stronger berm. Before they could finish, the earth around them convulsed, leaving only twisted metal and silence. The sense grew that the Americans were not merely firing but listening, measuring each response, learning exactly where to aim next. It was an intelligence of steel. The psychological weight pressed harder than the blasts themselves. Every man had been raised to accept death in battle, but death was supposed to have shape, a charge met by steel, a foe's eyes seen before the end. This was different. Impersonal, distant, unstoppable. Spirit could not close the gap to a gun miles away. Courage could not outrun a shell timed a second. For the first time, endurance felt useless. When lows came, they were brief and treacherous. Silence carried its own threat. Men would crawl out to refortify a wall or shift a wounded comrade only for the quiet to break again. Corrected fire slamming down where movement had betrayed life. The Americans adjusted as though some unseen observer hovered overhead marking every step. Rumors spread. Enemy spotters with magic glasses. Planes circling unseen above the clouds. Radios able to hear whispers. Each tale magnified the sense that nothing remained hidden. By days in the lines that had once been strong defensive webs were ragged and half-buried. Supply caches gone. Ammunition sodden or buried under tons of churned earth. Water barrels pierced and leaking into mud. Men staggered out of pits with ringing ears and shaking hands, covering the pace of sweat, soil, and blood, not always their own. The strongest among them tried to speak steadiness back into the group, but their voices rasped, thin against a memory of that measured destruction. When darkness finally returned, it felt uncertain, a cover that might be ripped away at any moment by the next salvo. Some prayed. Some sat in silence, clutching bayonets useless against horizons they could not touch. They had imagined fire as close and personal, man to man. Instead it came cold and precise, drawn with numbers on distant maps. Instructors had taught how to fight hunger, how to ambush patrols, how to kill swiftly and die with honor. No one had taught how to withstand a machine that did not tire, that could rain steel from beyond sight until the ground itself seemed to give up. The realization settled in like smoke. A new war had arrived, and spirit alone was not enough. Dawn came heavy with smoke, curling low across the shattered beach and hanging in the palms like torn cloth. Through that gray curtain came a sound no one had heard before, deeper than mortars and steadier than ships. The grinding roar of engines on sand. At first it seemed the earth itself was moving. Then shapes emerged, hulking, armored, unstoppable. Tanks pushed forward in slow, deliberate lines, steel hides dark with salt and mist. Behind them followed squad amphibious tractors, their treads chewing the shore, ramps lowering to spill out more machines, more men, more supplies than seemed possible. The defenders had built their plans on nearness. They were fighters of shadow and blade, masters of ambush and close assault. Everything in training pointed to turning terrain into trap. Stalk the jungle. Strike before the enemy organizes. Drag him into a duel of courage where hunger and endurance decide the day. But nothing about this enemy suggested disarray. The machines rolled with measured patience, unhurried and unafraid. Bullets rattled and sparked harmlessly against angled armor. Mortar shells splashed dirt, but left treads grinding forward. Even mines, buried carefully in the night, fail more often than not. Those that detonated slowed nothing. A tank simply stopped, shifted, and another took its place. Behind the armor came the weight of organization. Supply vehicles trundled off landing craft, each stacked with crates and barrels, ammunition, and fuel. More tractors arrived towing howitzers. More boats beached with bulldozers ready to scrape new roads into the jungle. Within hours, invaders were building their own small city where beach had been empty hours before. Canvas shelters rose, radios clicked and buzzed, engineers swung picks and shovels to carve clearings for the next wave. The defenders watched from tree lines and broken bunkers, stunned by the speed and scale. They had imagined landing troops, frightened, scattered, easy prey. They saw instead a living organism with its own heartbeat, pulsing supplies and firepower inland like blood. The first counterattack died almost as soon as it began. A handful of squads, desperate to stop the advance before it thickened, slipped from cover and tried to circle the machines. They were met not just by rifles, but by guns bolted into turrets that turned and fired faster than men could aim. Each charge faltered under canister rounds and sweeping bursts. Smoke grenades meant to blind were answered by flares that washed the field in white light. Even those who managed to reach the treads found armor too thick for bayonets, too high for grenades to reach vents or tracks. The machines shrugged off heroism. By afternoon, the beachhead had become fortress. Trucks arrived with more shells, more food, more men, and the line of tanks stretched inland, disappearing into haze. Road graders smoothed paths overnight. Fuel drums lined new clearings. The jungle's protective maze, once so sure, was cut open by steel and engineering. Where days of labor had built narrow paths, in hours wide roads appeared, hard enough for trucks to roll without pause. Among the defenders, silence grew heavier than orders. They had been told that supply would always be thin, that hardship was natural, that true warriors required little. Now they watched an enemy for whom lack seemed unknown. These men were fed, their guns endless, their machines self-sustaining. Even wounded tanks were not abandoned. Others dragged them back, while fresh ones filled the gap. It felt less like fighting soldiers, and more like standing against an entire nation come ashore. Night patrols brought little relief. Searchlights swept arcs across the dark. Engines rumbled without pause, a low mechanical heartbeat in the trees. Ammunition, already scarce, was hoarded to a whisper. Every bullet had to count while the enemy poured fire as though it cost nothing. The old teachings, valor, willpower, death before defeat, felt suddenly small beside the slow, unstoppable crawled industry. Some tried to cling to the code, to whisper that spirit would still find a way. But even the strongest felt something shift inside. Machines had lengthened the enemy's arm beyond reach. They turned jungle into road, beach into port, scarcity into abundance. Each mile gained by treads meant another mile lost to the idea that courage alone could hold ground. In the flickering light of burning palms, men sat with rifles across their knees and listened to engines grind deeper inland. They had been taught to expect hunger, fear, and pain. They had not been taught what to do when the fight arrived as an entire moving world, armored, fed, and endlessly supplied. That night the jungle seemed smaller, the island finite, and the war larger than any heart could hold. The first sign was sound, a steady mechanical chatter that did not stop. At dawn, when mist still hung heavy and birds called somewhere deep in the canopy, the Americans began to fire. Not the scattered bursts the men had learned to endure, but a constant hammering, a roar that rolled across the ridges and seemed to go on without breath. Machine guns swept the jungle edge until branches sheared off like grass and splinters flew like knives. Every few minutes came the deeper thump of heavier calibers, the flat cracking of rifles layered between. It was not a battle so much as a river of bullets carving new terrain. Japanese squads moved with care, each man aware of the count in his mind. A dozen rounds in one pouch, 8 left in the next, 3 precious grenades between them. They had learned to fire once, maybe twice, before shifting position, conserving for the moment when an enemy came close enough for a sure shot. Each cartridge mattered. The officer's voice was always somewhere near. Do not waste. In the early days, that discipline had felt like an edge. But here it meant silence while the jungle tore apart under endless incoming fire. Foxholes shrank as men curled smaller inside, mud spattering their helmets. Bunkers shook under the unending percussion. When someone tried to return fire, a burst from above answered instantly, heavier and longer, drowning it out. A few soldiers risked short bursts, only to feel the air around them turn white-hot as heavier weapons locked on. .30 caliber fire cracked like whips. The deeper .50s chewed through palm trunks and sandbag walls. Earth sprayed like water. The idea of cover began to unravel. An attempt to launch a counterattack lasted mere minutes. A squad slipped forward through brush, careful and silent. But as soon as one man fired, the jungle erupted. Dozens of guns pivoted as if guided by unseen hands. Belts and ammunition fed smoothly through dark barrels. Tracers stitched the air red and green. The squad fell back broken, some dragging wounded, others crawling alone. Behind them the noise did not lessen, a reminder that the enemy could afford to fire long after targets disappeared. Between assaults, there was no reprieve. The Americans seemed to have no bottom to their stockpiles. Boxes of cartridges appeared on shoulders and trucks as if conjured. Gunners swapped belts midstream, barrels smoking, hands steady, rhythm never faltering. Even when one weapon overheated, another took its place. The tempo never broke long enough for hope to form. Inside shattered positions, men cleaned mud from their last bullets, whispering counts to themselves like prayers. One officer gathered a squad and distributed single rounds by hand, palm to palm, as though passing water. Faces stayed blank, but the knowledge hung heavy. Each shot must matter, but the other side's shots would come whether they mattered or not. At night the impression deepened. American flares hissed and bloomed overhead, revealing crates stacked behind new lines, silhouettes of gunners feeding belts without hurry. From far away came the cough of mortars and the low growl of vehicles bringing more. Supplies seemed like tide and moon, effortless, inevitable. Hunger and thirst had been expected. This sense of fighting a foe who could never be emptied had not. By the second day, the psychological toll was worse than wounds. Men trained to meet death without flinching felt something unfamiliar. Futility. Heroic charges taught in drill became senseless against a storm that did not pause. Fire that should have been answered by silence came back doubled, tripled, until ears rang and lungs ached with smoke. Courage felt too small when every brave step triggered more lead than could be counted. One soldier, mud-caked and shaking, stared at his rifle after firing his last round and muttered words no one had said aloud. They do not run out. Around him, others looked away, unwilling to name the thought, but unable to escape it. The code had promised endurance would be enough, but endurance alone could not fill an empty magazine. On these beaches and ridges, the fight had become a calculation far beyond spirit, and the math belonged to the side whose belts and crates never ended. The first crate was pried open with but a rifle, nails shrieking as the lid came free. Inside, under wax paper and canvas, lay things that seemed impossible so close to the front. Cans gleamed in neat rows, their labels bright and crisp. There were tins of meat sealed tight against air and moisture, biscuits in heavy paper sleeves, powdered drinks, chocolate bars wrapped in foil. A soldier reached in, hesitant, and lifted one of the cans. It was heavy, perfect, unmarred by rust or dents. He shook it softly, listening to liquid move inside. Around him, others leaned closer, eyes wide and quiet, as though seeing something half magical. They had expected enemy rations to be clumsy or thin, as desperate as their own. Instead, every package seemed designed for care as well as utility. Open one and a small miracle unfolded. Meat still rich with scent, crackers crisp, sugar sweet and strong. Even the spoons were new and smooth, stamped from bright metal. Alongside the food were cigarettes, matches sealed against rain, Packets of salt and sugar so finely measured it felt like luxury. A man who had eaten roots and dry rice for weeks held a bar of chocolate as though it might vanish. Other caches offered more astonishment. Radios, compact, clean, their parts gleaming, sat protected in layers of wax cloth. Spare batteries, spools of wire signal flags, headphones. Medical kits spilled open to reveal bandages individually wrapped, antiseptic in small glass bottles, morphine in neat ampoules, scissors and clamps polished to a high sheen. Someone murmured a prayer or a curse. It was hard to tell which. Back home, even military hospitals scrounged for gauze and alcohol. Here, these things were being left behind, plentiful enough to abandon and retreat. The realization rippled silently. This was not the stockpile of men barely hanging on. This was surplus. And if they left as much, what did they keep? Comfort and readiness could exist together, apparently. The long-told belief that softness made a soldier weak looked suddenly false. These Americans, who ate well and kept themselves supplied, had not broken under fire. They had advanced behind mountains of goods, and those goods had not dulled them. They had sharpened them. A few men tried the foreign food immediately. The taste struck hard, salt, fat, sweetness all at once. One young corporal took a bite of biscuit, his face unreadable, then finished it quickly, almost angrily, as if refusing to admit pleasure. Another sipped a powdered drink mixed hastily with canteen water and stared at the cup, lost in thought. They had been taught that luxury was rot, that true warriors thrived on deprivation. Yet the enemy who lived on these rations seemed far from weak. They built airstrips under bombardment, fired without pause, hauled wounded behind armor lines, and returned the next day stronger. When night came, the men sat around a small lamp and sorted through what they had taken. There were murmurs about the radios, the neatness of the kits, the quiet wealth of it all. Someone said what others were thinking. If they can throw this away, how deep must their stores run? No one answered. The question hung heavier than the smoke from a newly lit cigarette. In the days that followed, small changes crept into thought and talk. Silence stretched longer after old boasts about Spartan endurance. Eyes lingered on the chocolate wrappers tucked carefully into pockets, on the dry bandages replacing blood-soaked cloth. A few dared to suggest that supply itself was a kind of weapon, to march well-fed and patched, to fight with full magazines and working radios, to treat wounds before infection. Maybe this was not softness, but another form of strength. The instructor's old lesson still echoed, but cracks had formed. Hardship had forged them. Yes, but what if the enemy's abundance forged something stronger? Not weakness, but reach, speed, recovery. If an army could care for itself without faltering, it could fight again and again while scarcity wore others thin. The thought was unsettling, even dangerous, but it would not leave. When the next firefight came and men scrambled for cover, some clutched their new bandages and American canteens. A private slid a foreign chocolate bar into his tunic before crawling forward. The taste of plenty and the smell of antiseptic followed them through the mud. For the first time, the idea that deprivation was always power began to fade. They had seen another way of war, one where a soldier's comfort was not indulgence but design, and where readiness meant having what you needed, not going without. The myth of softness had cracked open with every pride and every wrapper torn. What seeped out was not surrender, but a slow, reluctant respect and a deeper unease. The war was no longer just spirit against machinery. It was spirit against a system vast enough to feed and heal while still advancing. And somewhere inside, each man understood that belief alone might not be enough to answer it. The sea lay quiet beneath a pale morning when the first shadows passed overhead. Men looked up from trenches and shattered palms and saw the familiar silhouette of their own Zero fighters banking high, sun glinting off narrow wings. Relief stirred. Air cover had come at last. The hunters of the Pacific were famous for grace and kill counts. The men on the ground knew their pilots to be artists of the sky, trained from boyhood to feel air currents like water, to turn and dive with impossible precision. The sight meant hope. But beyond the first silver arcs came more shapes, darker, thicker, and strangely numerous. The noise rose in layers, deeper and heavier than the clean hum of the Zeros. Soon the sky seemed to carry an entire storm, Hellcats and Corsairs pouring in from distant carriers, their engines a different pitch altogether. They flew higher at first, then descended in disciplined swarms, not solitary hunters, but waves working as one. Radios chattered among them. Movement looked rehearsed, controlled, like a giant animal flexing invisible muscle. The first merge happened so fast that the men below hardly followed it. A handful of Zeros darted upward, climbing for advantage, but the enemy simply rose higher still, cutting arcs too steep and long for the lighter Japanese planes to match. Shots cracked and flashed. One Zero spiraled down trailing black smoke before its pilot could even fire. Another tried to slip behind Corsair, only to find two Hellcats already sliding into position, guided by unseen signals. What had once been dance and intuition now looked like a chess match played with better pieces. Pilots who returned later spoke in voices stripped of old swagger. The enemy seemed to know where they were before they arrived. Radar, a word that felt half mythical before, was now feared as truth, a network watching from ships and pickets far beyond sight, feeding coordinates to every fighter. The Zeros could surprise nothing. Every climb, every bank was met with interceptors already turning to meet them. Worse still, those American planes stayed in the air forever. While the nimble Zeros burned precious fuel and turned home after short duels, the heavier, thirsty machines somehow stayed. Tank after tank feeding from carriers and long-range designs that let them linger and hunt. Numbers finished what technology began. For each pair of Japanese fighters, 4, 6, sometimes more enemy planes arrived. Engagements that once relied on skill devolved into swarms, where even the sharpest maneuver ended with fresh pursuers diving in. Pilots who had practiced for years to outturn and outclimb opponents found themselves pinned by fire from angles they could not counter. The old faith that one well-trained man could offset many faltered midair, betrayed by radio's radar and sheer mass. From the ground, the change felt immediate. Air once friendly turned hostile. Supply convoys tried to move under canopy but were spotted and strafed until nothing remained but twisted metal. Ammunition dumps hidden in thickets burst into flame after a single pass from planes that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Even night no longer offered safe cover. Flares felt like artificial dawn and gunfire stitched the dark. Zeros sent to chase these raiders seldom returned. Every dogfight told the same silent truth. Courage could not refill tanks or conjure spare parts. While Japanese mechanics coaxed life from weary engines and patched bullet holes with scrap, the enemy rotated fresh squadrons from decks floating miles offshore, ships that seemed inexhaustible. The art of flight had become an equation. The Americans solved it with numbers, fuel, and foresight. Pilots trained for individual duels now faced a net that caught every move. For the soldiers below, the shift felt like a curtain falling. Once they had looked up and seen guardians. Now they saw sky owned by someone else. Bombers came behind the fighters. Heavier shapes escorted like royalty, and rained ordnance on positions already softened by artillery. No one could answer. The few aircraft left launched desperate sorties, but each mission felt like sacrifice rather than battle. At night, some men still whispered faith in skill and spirit, but more stared into the dark sky, hearing engines even when none flew. They understood now that mastery of the air was not about bravery alone. It was about seeing first, reaching far, staying aloft as long as you wished. It was about making the enemy's choices irrelevant before he even acted. The proud Zeros had met a new kind of war and found that elegance and courage were no match for a system that turned sky into certainty. The realization stung like betrayal. Training had promised a quality of struggle. 2 men, 2 machines, courage deciding. Instead, the fight above had become invisible and mathematical. Down below, troops packed tighter into whatever cover they could find, bracing not for duels, but for the next precise strike called from somewhere beyond sight. The sky was closed now, sealed by reach and calculation, and every man on the ground felt its weight pressing down. The journey to Saipan began with the usual hard promises. Orders passed down through channels so the island must hold. Every officer repeated the words until they lost meaning and became rhythm. The men who landed and dug in there were veterans of hunger and jungle cunning, proud to be the spine of defense. They believed that if they endured long enough, the invaders would falter on sharp ground and thick courage. Trenches laced the hillsides. Caves were stocked, fields of fire cleared. Each day of preparation felt like building a fortress out of sweat and will. Then the sea arrived. It came first as a horizon gone wrong, dark with ships beyond counting. At dawn the water itself seemed armored, ranks of vessels bristling with guns, more than any lookout had seen in one place. A single salvo broke the calm, followed by another and another until there was no pause between thunderclaps. Shells bigger than trucks landed with a violence that seemed to lift the entire island and set back down shattered. Hills folded where men had dug their living spaces. Palm forests vanished in gouts of dirt and flame. Whole trench lines disappeared without trace. Men who had worked for weeks were gone in a breath. Survivors stumbled from collapsed dugouts into a world without landmarks. Where ridges had been, there were new craters, some wide enough to swallow squads. Air stank of cordite and burning vegetation, thick enough to sting the eyes and throat raw. The bombardment did not sweep once and end. It rolled hour after hour, sometimes easing only to return harder, as if someone beyond sight adjusted calculations and drew a tighter circle. When the shelling paused, planes took its place. Bombers and fighters flew in layers so dense the sky looked like metal clouds. Bombs tore new scars into ground already churned beyond recognition. Strafing runs chased any movement. Wounded men who crawled into cover were forced to lie still while dirt shook again and again. Even those untouched by shrapnel felt their nerve fray. Each explosion slammed body against earth, robbed breath, filled ears with ringing and mind with static. Attempts to hold the line splintered before they could form. Communication vanished first. Radios crushed. Runners lost to sudden fire. Officers killed or cut off. When new waves of Americans moved ashore, they stepped onto beaches already stripped of defenses. Bunkers meant for ambush were open graves. Snipers fired single desperate shots and were smothered by immediate, precise response. Machine guns set to cover approaches lasted minutes before shells walked in on their muzzle flashes. Men spoke later of a feeling worse than fear. The sense that the island itself was dying under them. There was nowhere to anchor courage when even rock and earth betrayed. Plans dissolved as units lost cohesion. Survivors drifted in small groups or alone, clinging to whatever shelter remained. Hunger and thirst, once familiar adversaries, were forgotten in the face of exhaustion from simply staying alive between blasts. Some officers tried to rally counterattacks. A handful of soldiers gathered for night assaults, slipping through ruined ground with bayonets fixed. Most were cut down by flares and machine guns before reaching enemy lines. Those who returned carried haunted faces and fewer words. They had seen the invaders not as men, but as extensions of a force that prepared and supplied beyond imagining. By the battle's end, Saipan no longer felt like an island. It was a cratered plain under sky owned by someone else. Survivors who were taken prisoner or pulled from rubble carried more than wounds. They carried the quiet knowledge that everything believed about invincibility had met a wall of steel and logistics it could not climb. Pride remained, but it had been scorched, tempered into something heavier and less certain. In later telling, voices often faltered describing the moment they knew the fight was lost. It was not surrender to an enemy's bravery, but to an overwhelming presence that erased the ground itself. Men who had trained to outlast hardship realized hardship meant nothing when the very land turned against you. Saipan was where many stopped thinking in terms of duel and courage and began to understand war as a machine, vast, precise, and indifferent. It was a first deep crack in the belief that spirit alone could hold the empire's edges. The gates closed behind them with a final clang, but what waited inside was not the world they had been warned of. The first shock was simple: space. Fenced and guarded, yes, but wide and clean, lined with rows of neat barracks rather than cages or pits. The smell of cooking drifted across the compound, warm and rich in a way that cut through exhaustion and confusion. After weeks of bombardment and ruin, after the deafening crush of Saipan, the air here seemed impossibly still, until trucks rumbled in, not with soldiers but with supplies. Processing began at long tables where Americans moved with calm routine. Identification, medical checks, the tagging of gear. Wounds were examined by doctors with efficient hands and steady eyes, men who neither mocked nor hurried. Bandages were clean and plentiful, antiseptic stung but reassured. One soldier, expecting to be left bleeding, stared in disbelief as an orderly unrolled a fresh dressing for him alone. Another, half-starved and fevered, was handed water so clear it seemed unreal. Meals followed, and with them the unraveling of long-held certainties. Each prisoner received a tray heavy enough to surprise. Meat cut thick and steaming, bread soft and white, vegetables bright with color. There was coffee bitter and strong, and sometimes milk. Some men hesitated, suspicious of trick or insult, but hunger pressed harder than pride. The first bites broke something quiet and long-standing, the idea that an enemy must be cruel to be strong. Here was a foe who could feed not just his own, but those he had captured, and do so without visible strain. Days in the camp unfolded with an order that felt alien after chaos. Wake to a bell, line for roll call, work details, or rest as assigned. Guards walked the perimeters but rarely shouted. Discipline existed without constant menace. Medical stations functioned like small hospitals. Shelves of gauze and bottles, cabinets filled with tools polished and ready. When a man fell ill, he was treated promptly, and medicine appeared as if conjured. Antibiotics, fever reducers, vitamins. In Japan, even frontline officers had struggled to find such care for their own. The material world inside the wires seemed endless. Kitchens ran on stoves large enough to cook for thousands, fueled by deliveries that never missed a day. Warehouses stacked with canned goods and packaged bread looked like treasure houses. Clothing was issued when needed. Sturdy boots, work shirts, jackets against cold. Broken equipment was replaced, not patched to exhaustion. Prisoners who had hoarded scraps all war long found themselves holding surplus they could not imagine running out. Work details revealed even more. Some were sent to help unload supplies or maintain campgrounds. They saw trucks arrive filled with boxes printed with company names, some familiar from capture rations, others unknown. The flow was constant. Food, medical crates, tools, even sports equipment. Soccer balls bounced across open yards. Books and magazines circulated among barracks. It was a kind of abundance that felt casual, not curated to impress, but normal to men who lived with it. Conversations with guards, when language allowed, deepened the unease. These were young Americans, often farmers or clerks before the war, yet they spoke of home as places where roads were smooth and stores full. They talked about cars waiting in garages, radios in every house, movies, machines, and jobs that paid enough to keep families fed and clothed. They spoke without boasting. It was simply their world. For men raised to believe the enemy decadent and soft, these glimpses carried a different meaning. A society both wealthy and capable, able to fight far from home without starving its own. Letters permitted through censors added another dimension. Prisoners wrote of unexpected treatment and supplies that felt endless, though pride sometimes muted the words. Some admitted astonishment outright. We were enemies, yet they give us meat and medicine. Others kept their tone dry, but described enough to let families know something profound. The Americans were not what they had been taught. In time, the very rhythm of camp life became its own lesson. Planning was invisible but constant. Things simply worked. Meals arrived on schedule, water stayed clean, sickness was managed, work assigned and completed. Even punishment, when rare incidents required it, was measured and administrative rather than chaotic or cruel. What had been drilled into them as decadence now looked like competence. At night, lying on bunks with full stomachs and clean bandages, many thought back to the training fields and the jungle. They remembered instructors praising scarcity as sharpening and need as purifying. Yet here was proof that comfort and power could walk together. The enemy had not grown weak by feeding and supplying itself. It had grown formidable. To watch a system hum along even for captives was to glimpse its reach and feel, quietly and unwillingly, respect. These were not lessons the men had sought, and not all could accept them. Some clung to pride and old explanations, calling it propaganda or temporary show. But day after day, the evidence accumulated. Abundance was not softness. Readiness need not mean deprivation. Inside the wire, even defeat taught. And the knowledge took root slowly, preparing those who survived to return home changed, carrying an understanding of war and power far larger than the barracks that first forged them. The first letters that carried doubt did not speak it aloud. They came from hospital cots and quiet corners of the prison camps, written by hands still swollen from labor or healing from burns. At first the words circled around weariness, the exhaustion of nights under bombardment, the sickness of losing whole companies without ever seeing an enemy face. But between the lines something else emerged, an unease the old slogans could not hold. Men who had once sworn that hardship was strength now admitted what they had seen, no matter how sharp the spirit. It dulled before endless steel. Diaries whispered it earlier than letters. In penciled script in half-lit bunkers, soldiers recorded the strange arithmetic of modern war. They described watching the horizon pour fire for hours, while their own ammunition could be counted in a single hand. They wrote of digging and redigging holes that vanished under shells mapped from miles away, of charging brave and fast only to meet belts of bullets that never seemed to end. One entry, later found in the pocket of a dead sergeant, put it simply, "We are raindrops. They are the storm." The change came slowly but with a weight impossible to ignore. Before battle, talk once full of confidence grew measured. Young soldiers still spoke of honor, but older ones watched the sky and listened for engines. The proud myths of one man with a rifle holding back many began to crack each time a carefully prepared ambush was shredded by artillery before it began. Courage, they found, could not refill a magazine or mend a splintered trench. Some of the clearest reckonings came from pilots. They had been trained as duelists, taught to feel air like an extension of the body, but returned shaken. Letters from airmen described facing enemies who knew their position before contact, who climbed higher, stayed longer, struck from radar's invisible hand. "I danced," one pilot wrote, "but they moved with the whole sky." His zero had been fast and graceful, but no grace outlasted fuel and numbers. For infantry, realization often arrived during supply raids that once promised victory. After long, dangerous nights crawling through brush to strike at enemy stockpiles, they would find not scarcity but plenty. Lines of crates beyond counting, more food and ammunition than a battalion could carry. Burning a few seemed nothing when ships delivered more by morning. Each success felt smaller, each risk less meaningful, against an opponent that replaced loss faster than it could be inflicted. In the camps, where days ran with quiet efficiency, understanding deepened further. Here was the enemy machine revealed in miniature. Food enough to waste, medical care routine, planning so precise it felt invisible. The same order that fed captives also built fleets and armies. Scarcity had been taught as virtue, yet it now looked like a slow strangling of strength. The language of defeat changed, too. It was not cowardice they mourned, but the limits of old belief. They began to speak less of dying well, and more of living to adapt. Spirit is not enough. One diary confessed after months behind the wire, "The world is built differently now." Another wrote, "A sword cannot stop rain. A man cannot stop the factory." Even those clinging to pride could not fully shut out what eyes and stomachs knew. Machines, planning, and supply were not softness. They were force shaped with thought. The Americans had fought with comfort not because they feared pain, but because they could afford to spare their men and still win. That fact struck deep, overturning years of teaching that suffering itself gave power. In nights lit only by faint bulbs, men turned these truths over silently. Some felt shame, some awe, many both. They were warriors, yet war had outgrown the image taught to them. It had become an engine that turned labor and science into reach no blade or prayer could block. Diaries closed with single lines heavy enough to last lifetimes. "We must learn or vanish. The world is not as we were told." And again, scratched by tired hands, "Courage cannot outrun steel." The men who came home did not march with the crisp confidence shown in old parade photographs. They stepped off trains thinner, quieter, eyes searching landscapes that felt smaller than the ones they had left. Families met them with flags and careful smiles, but the soldiers' faces betrayed a shift harder to name. Beneath the greetings and gifts was the unspoken cargo of memory. Months of surviving storms no human spirit could stop. They brought back scars and new truths, heavier than metals, heavier than the rifle surrendered. In the early months of return, silence covered much of it. Pride was stubborn. So were the teachings drilled since youth. Many veterans tried to slip back into the language of honor and sacrifice, but letters and diaries leaked what mouths could not. Officers who commanded brave but doomed defenses wrote reports that mixed respect with cold arithmetic. Positions erased before engagement. Supplies exhausted in days. Casualties from bombardment rather than duels. Some quietly passed those notes upward, where thoughtful men in uniform read and reread the numbers until late at night. Gradually, behind doors closed the ceremony. A reckoning took shape. Senior commanders met in cramped offices, maps spread and cigarettes burning low. They studied the battle records and found patterns that courage alone could not break. Firepower, massed, accurate, sustained, had shattered fortifications long before infantry clashed. Air mastery had denied movement and supply. Logistics had made the enemy's reach nearly infinite. The realization cut against decades of teaching but was undeniable. War had become a system, not a test of soul. Young staff officers, some fresh from the ruins of Saipan and other island fights, began to speak bolder. They argued for mechanization, for better supply planning, for modern artillery and air coordination. A few had glimpsed American methods even as prisoners, cataloging how trucks and rail moved like veins and arteries, how radios tied distant units into one body. They returned with sketches of kitchens that never ran dry, hospitals that could appear in days, and networks that let soldiers fight fed and healed. These were not symbols of weakness, but tools of survival. Resistance lingered. Older generals bristled at talk of comfort and machines. They feared losing the spirit that had defined the Army's identity. But the ground truth from the defeated front kept knocking. Unrelenting casualty counts, the speed with which strongholds fell, the crushing tempo of modern offense. Silence was no longer protection. Too many young veterans refused to let myth hide what they had seen. Gradually the language shifted. Training manuals began to mention supply as lifeblood rather than afterthought. Studies circulated on field fortifications and how to resist bombardment with depth and dispersion rather than singular heroics. Engineers and logisticians, once supporting characters, gained new status. Factories and shipyards were spoken of not just as national assets, but as extensions of the battlefield itself. The very word spirit stayed, but now paired with preparation, technology, coordination. Academies rewrote lessons. Cadets still saluted banners and studied Bushido, but alongside came classes in industrial planning, modern gunnery, and air defense. Officers learned about radar, fuel lines, and the mathematics of artillery. Manuals on small unit tactics added pages on camouflage against planes, dispersion under shelling, and field repairs. The new generation was being asked to think beyond the rifle and bayonet, to see war as a vast architecture of supply and intelligence. Civilians, too, noticed a shift. Factories damaged by war were rebuilt with efficiency in mind. Engineers studied American assembly methods. Newspapers printed sober essays about production and preparedness rather than only sacrifice. Politicians debated budgets not just for arms but for the networks and science behind them. The country's pride had not vanished, but it was bending toward pragmatism. For the veterans themselves, change was more personal and uneven. Some clung to the old code as shield against humiliation. Others became teachers and reformers, quietly determined that no future soldier should stand empty against endless fire. They spoke at schools, wrote memoirs that mixed pain with hard advice, and advised planners who sought to rebuild with clear eyes. What took root in those post-war years was not surrender, but adaptation. A people long taught to worship scarcity began to imagine resilience built on more than will. Supply and care became recognized as power. Machines were no longer seen only as enemy advantage, but as tools to master. Pride remained, but tempered, less brittle, more aware of the cost of refusing change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new doctrine formed, one where courage was still honored but not alone, where sacrifice mattered, but so did survival and support. The veterans' memories of beaches stripped bare and skies filled with metal whisper behind every lecture and blueprint. They had learned too well what it meant to fight empty-handed. Now they were determined that if another war came, their sons would march with full magazines, strong supply, and eyes open to the real shape of modern battle. The decades after surrender unfolded slowly, marked not by grand declarations, but by steady work in classrooms, factories, and quiet military halls. The men who had seen the Pacific Campaign returned with memories heavy enough to change their world. They were not eager to speak of humiliation. Many never used the word, but their silence carried a kind of direction. It pushed planners and teachers to examine the true anatomy of the war they had lost. What emerged was not nostalgia, but resolve, a determination to build a country that would never again send its soldiers out hungry, undersupplied, and alone against machines that seemed to have no end. Early reforms began inside the military itself. Instructors who once prized blind endurance began teaching logistics as an art. Young officers studied maps not only for terrain, but for supply lines, depots, and industrial depth. They pored over capture manuals and their own field notes, dissecting how convoys had fed and armed American troops so far from home. At first, this learning felt like swallowing bitter medicine. Yet the veterans who guided it insisted on honesty. They had lived the cost of denial and were unwilling to let pride starve another generation. Factories echoed with similar shift. Industrial planners who had once measured success by thrift turned to efficiency and volume. They learned to count hours and output the way generals counted shells. Assembly lines took lessons from the very rations and weapons once found in captured caches. A culture long trained to endure scarcity began, awkwardly at first, to invest in abundance, not wasteful luxury, but reliable provision. The goal was not comfort for its own sake, but readiness. An army and a nation able to move, feed, heal, and rearm faster than any enemy. Civilian life changed with it. Schools encouraged study of science and engineering, areas once seen as distant from the soul of warrior culture. Young minds were taught to admire invention as well as courage. Shipyards rebuilt with new cranes and faster welding methods. Farms and distribution networks modernized so food could move quickly and survive long journeys. Even language shifted. People began to speak of resilience not just as stoic suffering, but as capacity, the ability to create and sustain. For the soldiers of the new army, this translated into different training. They still learned discipline and sacrifice, but now also supply chain planning, field medicine signals, and combined arms tactics. Marches were still long and hard, yet packs carried more than empty canteens and scant ammunition. Exercises included building field roads, coordinating air support, and protecting stockpiles. The next generation was told that valor must serve something larger, a system designed to last. In homes, fathers who had crouched in collapsing foxholes rarely told their sons everything, but they left small instructions. Keep your gear clean, yes, but also learn how to fix machines, how to move fuel, how to build where nothing exists. Be ready but not empty. Some carried foreign relics, like an opener from a captured ration, a bandage packet once found in a burned-out depot. They were reminders and warnings, silent arguments against the old belief that spirit alone was shield enough. Over time, that quiet lesson rippled outward. The nation's recovery itself became a study in supply and foresight, rebuilding ports, expanding rail, nurturing industries that could pivot if war returned. The economic miracle that outsiders admired had roots tangled deep in those wartime defeats. People who had once watched endless convoys and felt despair now built their own networks of trade and production, determined to wield abundance as protection. The military, smaller and constrained by new post-war realities, still absorbed the deepest truth. Modern war belongs to those who can keep fighting after the first shock. Courage mattered, but without food, ammunition, technology, and planning, courage was just a spark in rain. The veterans said this without bitterness. It was simply fact learned under fire. Their hard awakening became curriculum. As the years passed and the world changed again, those lessons endured. The country's self-image shifted subtly from romantic isolation to pragmatic readiness. Engineers and logisticians held as much respect as marksmen. When younger soldiers drilled on modern ranges, they were told to remember Saipan, not as shame, but as proof of what happens when one is left alone. In quiet corners of museums and war memorials, faded diaries speak to this transformation. Their lines, once personal, have become national ethos. Spirit must be joined to system, sacrifice to supply. Out of defeat grew not despair, but a new idea of strength, one built to last beyond any single charge or desperate stand. And though few say aloud, there's a kind of pride in that too. pride in surviving enough to learn, and in building something stronger for those who will never know hunger on the line or watch the sky close and wonder why courage was not enough.